Okay. Hey, guess what? Guess what's back? Guess what's back, everybody? Anybody want to guess? How about in the back there? Mike, Debbie, anybody want to guess what's coming back?
No idea. What's coming back?
How about you guys in the back? 6 questions? Got a guess?
The show?
No. The show is back. What's coming back in February? Anybody have a guess?
Taco trivia.
Tacos and trivia at the Seminary Ridge Museum and Education Center, Saturday, February 15th. Bring your loving sweetheart out, 6 o'clock to 8:30 p.m. Join us for another lighthearted evening of family-friendly general trivia, but not about generals. Oh, for prizes, a taco bar will be provided by the Ragged Edge Catering. This evening is BYOB. The water, lemonade, and iced tea will be included, so bring your own booze. Registration is individual, but you may register up to 6 total people, which would be a full team at one time. Listen, last year we did this. Let's see, who was there? Mike was there, Debbie was there, right?
Yep.
Not Mikey B, though. Mikey B wasn't there. You're going to be there this time, Mikey, right?
Very possibly, maybe.
I think you should. You'll have fun. It was a lot of fun. Debbie was there. I'm sorry. Bethany was there. Cindy was there. Colby and Taylor were there. Veronica was there. Who else was there? Kath was there with Veronica. What trivia? What's that?
We were robbed.
We were robbed of a victory.
Yeah.
Because Taylor, I think it was Tayller, right? She, so it doesn't matter. Anyway, it was Taylor's fault. Okay, so what? It wasn't Taylor's fault?
No.
Oh, okay.
No, Taylor was right.
Was right.
Taylor was right.
And you
it
guys
was Colby's
had
fault.
Old.
Wrong.
No, we were
Old
right. You go by the questions.
From
it's our
the 1985 version of Trivial Pursuit.
So what you have to do is you've got to go to the Seminary Ridge Museum's website, which is seminaryridgemuseum.com. And sign up there. You could also call 717-339-1300 or email them info@seminaryridgemuseum.com. Listen, honestly, folks, it's a lot of fun. We have a great time. Bring whatever booze you want. Have fun with it. Enjoy yourself, because we're going to do the same thing. And let's see who wins. May the best team win. We'll see you in February. Don't forget, February 15th, tacos, trivia, and love.
Addressing Gettysburg.
Well, everyone got very quiet. So that's because I looked at my phone. It's 1:30. So why don't we begin? First off, welcome to Gettysburg National Military Park. My name is Christopher Gwinn. I'm the Chief of Interpretation and Education here at the battlefield. And as always, we're very grateful that you're here, that you're sharing your afternoon with us for what I hope will be an excellent conversation. Couple of announcements before we begin. As always, if you have a cell phone, please turn that to off or to silent or to vibrate or to stun, the mode of your choice. I will remind you that if you've missed a lecture, our good friends at Addressing Gettysburg have filmed virtually all of the programs that we've held this winter. You can find them on YouTube by looking for Addressing Gettysburg Winter Lectures, and the whole list is there. So whether you missed one or you want to rewatch, our thanks to Addressing Gettysburg and Matt Callery, who's over on the stage right there, for doing that for us. And then finally, if you're going to be around next Saturday, which is March the 2nd, we will have our final winter lecture of the season. That'll be on the history of Camp Letterman. That will not be in this theater. That will be in the Ford Education Room, which is just around the building at the far corner. And as always, that's at 1:30, free of charge, so I hope to see you there. With that said, let me introduce our special guest today, a gentleman that I suspect you know, either through his work or in person, Mr. D. Scott Hartwig. Scott was a 30-year veteran of the National Park Service, and for 20 of those, he served here as supervisory park historian. He was instrumental in the creation of this building, this Museum and Visitor Center experience. He guided and built the interpretive programming that occurred on the battlefield for a generation and left a huge mark. He worked closely with our partners, whether it's the Civil War Institute, the American Battlefield Trust, or of course our nonprofit partner in this building, the Gettysburg Foundation, which does tremendous work in helping us preserve, protect, and interpret the Gettysburg battlefield. He is the author of numerous books and articles on the American Civil War. Most significantly for our conversation today, To Antietam Creek, the Maryland Campaign of September 1862, which was published in 2012 by Johns Hopkins. And I Dread the Thought of the Place, the Battle of Antietam and the End of the Maryland Campaign, which came out last fall, also published by Johns Hopkins. We've called Scott out of retirement, brought him back to the field of action like George Washington, whisked him away from Mount Vernon to be with us this afternoon. So once again, please join me in welcoming Scott.
Thank you.
So our thought for the program was that rather than have a traditional lecture, we'd have a conversation with Scott. A conversation about obviously the Battle of Antietam and his book, his works on the Maryland Campaign, but also on the craft of history. So how you create something like this, the process by which you research, by which you write, by which you delve into the past to create something as sweeping as To Antietam Creek and I Dread the Thought of the Place. I know where I want to end. I'm not quite sure how we're going to get there, and that's okay. I have questions that'll kick us off, but ultimately I'd like to turn it over to you all to continue the conversation. And once we're done, I'm going to whisk Scott away to the bookstore where he's graciously agreed to do a book signing. And so if you've not purchased either of his two books, our good friends, the Museum Bookstore, have it in stock. And I encourage you to pick it up if you haven't done so already. Scott, first off, thank you again for being here.
It's a pleasure to be here.
So these are sweeping books, as I mentioned. These are authoritative in terms of the Battle of Antietam and the Maryland Campaign. And nothing like this just comes about in and of itself. And so when you look at something, I mean, these two books are about 900 pages a pop. You don't create something like that without being really passionate about the subject matter. And so my first question to you is, I guess, where did that passion begin? So all of us here, we're here because at some point in our lives, we got interested in the past, or the American Civil War, the Battle of Gettysburg, or the Battle of Antietam. And so for you, where did that begin?
I think anybody in here of my age, it's probably the same story for you. It was the centennial of the Civil War. So I was a little kid. Life magazine had all sorts of articles about Civil War battles. Disney did Johnny Shiloh, which I loved. All those different kind of hokey Disney films that really made you want to know more and learn more and go to visit these places. So all of that just led in this progression. You start with the most elemental and then you start to read more. And I remember my mom taking me to the library and talking to the librarian. I don't know how old I was. 9, 8, something like that. And she said, he's really interested in the Civil War. What do you recommend that he read? And he pulled out for me Up Came Hill, which is about A.P. Hill, and The General to His Lady, which was the letters of Dorsey Pender to his wife. And
that's a very strange recoendation.
It
Not to interrupt your flow of thought.
It was.
It's a very strange recommendation.
It was, but it ended up being a really good one because Pender's letters, I didn't understand them at that time, of course. I didn't really understand them. I just thought he was like a cool guy, and he was like he was a general, but it just sparked more of an interest in me in wanting to learn a little bit more. And of course, for the Battle of Antietam, where did my interest in Antietam come from? I would say that it came from Mr. Lincoln's Army by Bruce Catton. So Catton was just an unparalleled writer and storyteller. And I know a lot of people criticize that, his research, even though his research editor or the person who did his research for him was my professor at University of Wyoming. That was E.B. Long. And E.B. Long, I still never met anybody who knew as much about all facets of the Civil War as E.B. Long did. I mean, his knowledge was unbelievable about the war. But you can say what you want about Catton, that maybe his sourcing is not as deep as you might want it to be, but he captured the feeling of the people who lived the Civil War. And he was old enough, he knew people who'd been in the Civil War. When he was a young man, he knew people who'd been in it. So it wasn't like these people were foreign to him. They were a part of his life. And he brought it alive to me, and I never forgot, and all the things he wrote about in Mr. Lincoln's Army or Glory Road. Stillness at Appomattox is an amazing book, but I never forgot his description of Antietam. And I always thought, one day if I ever write anything, I'd love to write something about Antietam.
Did you go to the University of Wyoming to study with E.B. Long?
No. I just wanted to work outdoors. That's what I wanted to do. So I wanted to be a wildlife manager. And so that's what I started in, until I found out to be a wildlife manager, you have to take biochemistry.
That changed your trajectory?
And pass it. And that's when I changed, and changed to it did teach me things that I use in the Park Service, but I would never major in this today. Park and recreation, outdoor park and recreation management. And I had a minor in natural resources and in history, in U.S. history. So, but when I got there to Wyoming, I learned about this guy, E.B. Long, and he taught this course, The American Civil War and Reconstruction. So I took it, and every lecture that E.B. Long gave was, it was like the greatest program. If you were in a Civil War roundtable or you're attending a lecture here, it was like the lecture you would always, every one he gave was like that. He really got you into it. And then I subsequently took 2 more courses from him. One was like an independent study with him, so it was almost like a graduate level course, even though I was an undergraduate. And so he really helped prepare me, and I remember back with amusement on when I started in the summer of 1979 as a seasonal at Gettysburg, and I arrived here and I thought, man, I'm pretty cool stuff, I really know my stuff. And then I met Greg Coco, and I realized I don't know as much as I think I do. And then I started realizing just how gigantic this subject of the American Civil War was, and you become a lot more humble, and you realize you've got a lot to learn. And but anyway, that's kind of
professionally though. So you go from the University of Wyoming, you get a seasonal position here at Gettysburg. Now your intent is to be a park ranger historian at the Battlefield Park.
Yeah, so my major in outdoor park and recreation management, one of the professors that we had was Myron Sutton, and he was a Park Service professional who had set up national parks in Nepal and several other countries around the world. And he was, essentially, I think the Park Service didn't know what to do with Myron Sutton. Yeah. So they loaned him to the University of Wyoming to teach. And I took 2 courses from him, and what I learned from him is that I wanted to work for the National Park Service, and I wanted to do history. Yeah. And so that perked my interest that, okay, I can marry up what I love about history with my major in outdoor park and recreation management, and also my desire to want to work outdoors. Yeah. And one other thing that I would add here, we live in an era today where everybody gets down on people who work in the government. But I grew up in an era in which, you wanted to do more than just go out and make money. And, I always just tried to live that.
I think thinking about some of the folks that we have here today, the younger folks, I see that in them, though, too. I think that still exists. Yeah. What I think is different, though, is you went right from the University of Wyoming to Gettysburg, and then you became a permanent ranger at Gettysburg, and then the supervisory historian at Gettysburg, which, in terms of Park Service career trajectories, that's not normal. No. Usually they send you off to the dry Tortugas or the gates of the Arctic National Park, and you have to struggle. That's relatively rare, though.
Yeah, no, I was very, very lucky. I mean, within a year, well, the year I arrived here, Mamie Eisenhower passed away.
Okay.
As superintendent of the park at that time, John Ernst, he really wanted to open the Eisenhower Historic Site as quickly as he could. And so they opened it in 1980. I got hired to be a park ranger at Eisenhower National Historic Site. Oh. And then within a year, I was able to transfer back to the battlefield. Mm-hmm. And it was really unusual for me to be able to spend my career at Gettysburg. But in some ways, I felt like I worked at the same place, but it was like I had all these different jobs that I did. So I was a park ranger. Then I was a supervisory ranger of the Cyclorama Center, where my daily task was to sprint up the ramp of the cyclorama to fix the broken cyclorama program. I stayed in really good shape doing that. And then from there became the supervisory historian, because the interpretive division assumed responsibility for the Park Research Library. And then we started work after 2001 on the planning for this building. Mm-hmm. So we did all of that. So there were all these different epochs that I went through, and then we started planning for the 150th anniversary of the battle. Mm-hmm. And after we did the 150th, I was like, I've done it. I'm good.
Time to ride off in the sunset.
Yeah, I'm going to ride off.
So I think we established you as kind of a Gettysburg guy, and I think most of the public, at least previously, knew you as someone associated with Gettysburg, be it through your programming or your writing, or they saw you on C-SPAN or PCN or what have you. How does Antietam come about? So when do you decide, I'm going to write the definitive history of the Antietam campaign?
I was at the information desk in the Cyclorama building with Greg Coco and Paul Shevchek, and we were sitting there like we often did if there was no visitors around, talking about Civil War battles and campaigns that nobody really written extensively about. And we were carrying on, and at that time period, there was only 2 books about the Battle of Antietam. The Antietam and Fredericksburg by Francis Palfrey, who was in the 20th Massachusetts and was wounded in the battle. And that book was published, I think, in 1887, 1889, somewhere around then. And Jim Murfin, A Gleam of Bayonets, which was published, I think, in 1962. Stephen Sears' book, this was about the time when we're having this conversation, Sears' book was going to come out in 1983. And I remember we're having this conversation, and I said, one battle that really isn't covered very well is the Battle of Antietam. I'm going to write about it. Not realizing at all what I was talking about. Just really stupidly thinking that I could just churn out a book here. But that was really kind of where it started. And then I starting to research Antietam from that point. And it was also, the thing about Antietam is that Antietam was not Gettysburg. Uh-huh. You just couldn't, I was very interested in the Civil War, but I was also interested in the Civil War, not just Gettysburg. So I wanted to do something that was outside of Gettysburg. I worked Gettysburg all the time, so you don't want to do that in your evenings, come home and then get back into Gettysburg.
Yeah.
You kind of
cleanse the palate.
Maybe go insane eventually if you're doing that.
So you have this idea, you're going to write the history of the Battle of Antietam. You dedicate yourself to begin researching. So with something as huge as the Battle of Antietam, how do you even begin to delve into that research process? So where did you start first? What was your first kind of step to begin the book?
Well, the first thing you do with any subject is you have to read some general studies about it. So you read Jim Murfin, mm-hmm. You'd read Francis Palfrey, you'd read Stephen Sears when he came out. You do have to be a little bit careful about reading too many secondary historians because they can shape how you think. So the next step that you want to do is you want to start reading official records of the event. So you start reading things like Lee's after-action report, McClellan's after-action reports. He wrote 2 of them. And then subordinate officers of them. You start to read reminiscences, battles and leaders of the Civil War, and you start to work your way down, and eventually you're going to work your way down into primary source material, which is unpublished, because that is the for a historian, that's the mother lode, that's the vein, that's the main vein. Everything else around that, in a way, is colored, because oftentimes, even after action reports, commanders are trying to put their actions in the best light, or they're trying to shape the narrative of how the battle is going, or the campaign is going to be remembered. That's particularly true of like commanding generals like a McClellan, particularly if they know that the report's going to get published. And reminiscences and post-war regimental histories, they're all trying to paint this kind of rosy, heroic, glorious glow. And the things that they wrote at the time, though, they weren't trying to do that, because they're writing home or they're writing to a friend or something like that. And they tended to be, even if it was a post-war and it was unpublished, this wasn't for anything that was to be published, they oftentimes would tell it. You know, as Walt Whitman said, the real war will never get in the books. Well, the real war could get in the books, but you had to find the right sources to find it. And that's really your unpublished primary sources. Now, when I say unpublished primary sources, there's a lot of really good sources that when I started this project were unpublished, today are published. And they're still great. Like I think of it was just recently published by a friend of mine, the letters of Charlie Mills, who was a lieutenant in the 2nd Massachusetts, later on became a staff officer. That's just an example of these sorts of unvarnished letters they're writing at the time, and they're telling you how they really feel about things that are going on. Whereas when you get into the post-war and the published items, then they still have value, but you have to ground truth them against other things.
Now, you're beginning this process in the 80s. This is pre-internet, Google Scholar, pre-internet archive.
This is like Martin Luther, man. I'm just writing things down.
You got your Gutenberg press. Did that change? So you Antietam Creek obviously came out first.
Yes.
And then the follow-up came out obviously last year. Did you do all your research for both books prior to beginning the writing process?
Not all of it, but a great deal of the assembly of the material that I needed was done while I worked on To Antietam Creek. Because obviously, and there were times that I would curse myself because, let's say I found some great account of the Battle of South Mountain, but the soldier was also at the Battle of Antietam, and I stupidly only photocopied the South Mountain part. And then I'd be working on Antietam. I'm like, oh yeah, I got that. And I'd pull it out, and I was like, oh God, I didn't have it. I didn't have these. So, I mean, you make some mistakes like that in the process of it. But I did. There was a considerable amount of extra research that I did for I Dread the Thought of the Place. And the other thing was, I had the advantage of when I was working on both of these, particularly To Antietam Creek. That was kind of a golden era of Civil War history. There were so many great things that were published at that time period, and there were so many people out there researching this and sharing their research that there was a lot of material that wasn't available to Stephen Sears, wasn't available to Jim Murfin, definitely wasn't available to Francis Palfrey.
Yeah. So I was going to touch on that a little bit. So as you're beginning this research process, did you come across something that just really surprised you?
Well, when we talk about I Dread the Thought of the Place, well, before I get to that, let me talk one thing about To Antietam Creek. And this kind of surprised me, is when I started the book, it was like, you know what, everybody has to psychoanalyze and dwell upon George McClellan. I'm not going to do that. I'm going to tell the military story. That's what I'm going to tell, the military story of the Maryland campaign. And so I started to work on it. And actually, initially, when I first worked on this, I wrote everything by hand. And then eventually I got this.
You kind of were like Martin Luther.
I was absolutely, man. I am a dinosaur.
Got your quill.
And then I got a K-Pro computer, and I thought it was like a space age. Anyway, the stuff I wrote was crap. I mean, it was just crap. And but the other thing I learned is that it was kind of like George McClellan reached through the mists of time and grabbed a hold of me and said, "Friend, you cannot understand the Maryland campaign. You cannot understand the Civil War in 1862 if you don't understand me." And he was right.
Yeah.
So I went back and I did a whole lot of reading and studying about George McClellan up to the eve of the Maryland campaign. And that's the whole first chapter into Antietam Creek. So there were a lot of surprises in there. And one of the things I tried to do is that, everybody, when you work on things like this, you all have your heroes and your villains. But the thing that you have to do as a historian is you have to set that aside. And when you're writing, because you need to be objective and honest to the people who lived. And you have to tell their story as honestly and as fairly as you possibly can. That doesn't mean that you may not praise things that they do and you may not criticize things that they do, because there's nothing worse than a historian who does all this work and then doesn't tell you what they found and doesn't tell you their interpretation. So I have definite opinions about George McClellan and what sort of general he was, and you'll find that in the first chapter of To Antietam Creek, and you'll find it in the last chapter of I Dread the Thought of the Place. Because in a lot of ways, to me, this was one big story here. And the story began with McClellan and it had to end with McClellan. So it ends with McClellan being removed from command of the Army in November of 1862. And I felt that kind of put that whole thing to rest. But anyway, learning about McClellan, I mean, there were a lot of interesting surprises to me about him. But as far as things that surprised me, and I Dread the Thought of the Place, I don't know that I would say these things surprised me, but they were things that I didn't know were necessarily true. One was at the Sunken Lane, I found one soldier, a Union soldier, who said that he saw white flags along the Sunken Lane from Confederate soldiers. And when I read that, I was like, oh, that didn't happen. There's no evidence. I've never seen any evidence that soldiers ever did that. And the way these guys fought, they fought fanatically. No way anybody was trying to surrender. And then I found another, and another, and another, and another, and another. And these weren't post-war. These were written at the time. And what I came to find is that some of the Confederates in the Sunken Lane realized, we're going to die here. This is a death trap, and there's no way out. Because the Sunken Lane, one of the misconceptions is that the Sunken Lane was a good position. Sunken Lane was not a good position. It was a bad position, but it was the best of the worst positions you could get in, because you might say, well, why weren't the Confederates up on the crest of the hill in front of them? Well, they would have been blasted by Union artillery if they were up there. So they couldn't be seen in the Sunken Lane. But the problem with the Sunken Lane is you couldn't get out of it once the Yankees got on the little ridge in front of you without getting shot. And that's what happened to them. And it was a Holocaust in there. So some of the Confederates were trying to surrender. And some of the Confederates didn't want to surrender. And some of the Confederates didn't realize some guys were trying to surrender. Surrender is messy. And the battle was chaotic. And that's what I try to convey in the story here, is that, we get these narratives that everybody was brave. There's no way. These men would never run before the enemy. They would blah, 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 all these sorts of things you read in the post-war histories that are almost nonsensical, a lot of this stuff. Yeah, the Confederate soldiers in the Sunken Lane were brave. But a lot of them wanted to live. They did not want to die. They did not want an Alamo. And if they could have surrendered and gotten out of there, but the problem was it was too confusing. So when some Union soldiers got up to go try to accept the surrender, they would be fired upon by other Confederates who didn't know anybody was surrendering or didn't agree with it. And then they're like, it's a trick. Pour it into them, boys. So it was a real tragedy. So that was one thing that I found that was really interesting and surprising. And the other one was, I had encountered this early on when I was researching Antietam about the Confederates wearing Union uniforms in A.P. Hill's division. I also considered that to be nonsense, that nobody's ever going to wear the other Army's uniform into a battle. And then I just found heaps of evidence by Union soldiers that And in fact, you can find it in the official reports. One of the Ohio brigade commanders from the Kanawha division is writing about how he didn't even fire on this line that was advancing towards him because he thought it was Union troops. So then I thought, oh, well, you know, what was going on is the Confederate uniforms were kind of dark, and in the mist and smoke of the battle and the time of day, they kind of looked like Union uniforms. Well, no. I mean, Union soldiers were very clear. A lot of these Confederates were wearing Union uniforms. Then I found a Confederate who was in Archer's brigade who said that when they captured Harper's Ferry, their clothing was in such poor condition that they exchanged a lot of their articles of clothing for Union uniforms because we were stockpiled at Harper's Ferry. There was lots of them. And he said, when we marched out of Harper's Ferry, we looked like a brigade from Boston. Now, the thing I thought about with that is, really, their officers let them do that? That did not make any sense to me. And the only way I can make sense of it, because nobody explains it, is that the officers reasoned, our soldiers are getting sick and falling out of the ranks because they do not have enough clothing to keep them warm on these cold nights and exposed to the elements. Mm-hmm. And gosh damn it, we're going to let them wear this clothing. Now, he did say, the same Confederate soldier, he said, as the march went on from Harper's Ferry to Antietam on the 17th, he said it got warm. And he says a lot of men shed the uniform jackets that they had. But enough of them were in Union uniforms by the time they got to Antietam that some of the Confederate units resembled Union units. And I don't think it was because they were trying to be deceptive. I think it was a practical matter is why they were doing it. So anyway, those were a couple of things that I found really, really interesting. And I know that some people will probably read those and go, Hartwig doesn't know what he's talking about. But the evidence that I found was overwhelming in both cases.
So while you're researching this, you're 90 minutes from the actual battlefield. And I think if you read a lot of military history, there are times when you can tell an author has never actually been to the actual battlefield.
Yeah.
But in your case, it's very accessible. So I'm wondering, what role does the actual battlefield park play, the actual ground, in your researching process?
Yeah, it played a huge role. So one of the ways that I approached every chapter, and I dread the thought of the place, every chapter about the battle, is I would go to the battlefield with my iPad or my tablet, and I would take all these videos of different areas of the field of what I was writing about in that particular chapter. And then I would narrate over the video what I was looking at, so then that way I would know. And the thing that was a little bit embarrassing is that sometimes when I would watch these videos, I would be like, that's wrong, Hartwig, what you just said. Because I'd subsequently find out that what I was saying on there was not right. Anyway, that was just invaluable to me, because you'd be writing and some soldier would be talking about thus and such. And, even if you've been there and spent some time there and you come back from there, you can't always remember some of the nuances on the ground. Well, when you had the video, you play the video and you look at it, oh, yeah, right, that's right. It brought these things back to mind. So, and you also see little things like, at this point, you couldn't be seen by anybody. The artillery couldn't see you, or the enemy infantry couldn't see you, or like if you do the Sunken Lane Trail, you really get a feeling, it's one of the trails they have down at the battlefield, you really understand how the soldiers of William French's division, when they were approaching the Sunken Lane, until they were right on top of the Confederates, didn't know they were there. They couldn't see them. They knew they were getting close, but they couldn't see them. And you can understand why Rufus Dawes would write on the morning of the 17th when Gibbon's brigade is advancing out of the North Woods. I know we all imagine these battles in the Civil War because we've watched North and South and Blue and Gray and Glory and all these movies, and they show all the soldiers standing in the open, all standing up, everybody standing, and they're firing at each other. And that is not the way these battles looked at all. So if you were a skirmisher in the 6th Wisconsin, when you left the North Woods, you couldn't see a single Confederate soldier. There were guns firing all over the place, artillery fire. You could see smoke rising from where Confederate batteries were. And then you saw smoke rising from where Confederate skirmishers were shooting at you, but you couldn't see the skirmisher because he was concealed. You couldn't see any of their main line of troops because they were concealed, because they used the nature of the terrain which is also very important when you're trying to study the battlefield, and the crops that are growing there. So the orchards, the cornfields, the corn stands 7 to 8 feet tall, the buildings, all of these things help conceal soldiers. They don't want to get shot, these guys in the Civil War. So they don't fight like you think they do, because our thinking on how they fight is shaped by the movies that we see.
When did you know you'd researched enough? We all meet people who are working on books or doing research, and you tend to accumulate just stacks and stacks of stuff.
Yeah.
And with something like Antietam, I imagine you just go on forever.
Yeah.
You just research forever.
Yeah.
You're going to another archive, you're looking at another book, you're pulling another newspaper. Did you have to stop yourself and say, Scott, I have done enough. I've done enough research. Time to write now.
You do have to stop yourself, because you'll never write anything if you don't. I mean, when I worked here at the park, I met legions of people who were going to write this book or that book. And I'm not going to say research is easy, because research isn't easy. Research is very time consuming. It can be really hard. If you've ever researched the National Archives, you know what I mean. They make it about as hard as possible for you to do any research there. But a lot of times you have to travel places and so on. And sometimes you dedicate a lot of time and you don't find anything at all of any value. But to me, I knew when I'd reached the point that I had enough to write this chapter. I can tell the story. Yes, you might always find something else. But when you get to, like, I'm going to find another enlisted man, he might have a really quotable line in a letter that he wrote. That would be really cool to put in there. But generally, the enlisted man and even the line officer isn't going to tell you something you don't already know, if you've already done your due diligence. The only thing you're going to find out there that might reshape your interpretation is maybe a staff officer, if he wrote something that sheds light on an incident or a decision or whatever that isn't really well documented. But it's hard for some people to know that point. I never really had a problem, because I love to write. It was so much fun to me to you sit down and you look at a blank screen on your computer, kind of a blank sheet of paper, and then you start to write. And you start to fill it in. And then the story starts to come alive. And to me, that's what the research is about, is to do that. That's what you do the research for, is to tell the story. So when you've got enough to tell the story completely.
And this is a practical question. So you're using Microsoft Word.
Yeah.
How are you synthesizing all this stuff? So what's your process? Are you just plugging it directly into that Word document? How are you doing that?
Yeah, well, I learned in the process of doing this that initially it was kind of chaotic. So I would be in the room, I would just have books and papers spread all over the place. And then you'd be writing and you're like, who wrote that one thing? You spend 45 minutes rummaging through all this junk. And here it is. Oh my God. I gotta get a cup of coffee or something. So and then I got smart. So what I would do, it took a lot of time to do this, but it was a huge help, is I would create what I called a notes chapter. So I would go through everything that I had, whether it was official reports, whether it was a letter a soldier wrote that was published in a newspaper, or a diary, or a journal, or whatever, regimental history, whatever it was. Everything that I had that, let's say we're talking about the chapter called Into the Corn, which follows the first Union units that go through the cornfield. I would find every single thing I had on that. And then I organized the notes by regiment or by individual, because I would also write some profiles of leaders that I wanted to tell their story. And so to give an idea of what these would be for, like, I remember one of the chapters that I think I wrote on the 9th Corps down on the southern end of the battlefield. My notes chapter was about 120 pages. The chapter that I finished and it became the book was like 30 to 35 pages. So you had way, way more in there than you're going to use. But the thing that was brilliant, about it, I'm not saying I was brilliant at all, because I'm not, but what's brilliant about it is that you had everything in one place on your screen, organized by unit, and you'd already typed it all in. So when you had something you wanted to quote, you just blocked it out, put it in the document. And it also helped you, the other thing I would do in every one of these notes chapters is I would create a timeline of what was happening everywhere on the battlefield at that moment in time. Because that helped you keep in mind that all these things aren't happening in a vacuum. So the attack, the orders that Burnside's getting to attack the lower bridge is not happening in a vacuum. What's going on in the northern end of the field? So this way you kind of knew what was going on. And those, along with the videos that I took of the battlefield, so you'd employ all of these when you'd put together a chapter.
I want to go back to McClellan. So you mentioned, he came through the mists of time to you, so let's drag him back again for a moment. I'm interested in how you approach McClellan, because I think the prevailing scholarship of the 70s, the 80s, even Bruce Cadden, reinforced by Stephen Sears, and even the Ken Burns Civil War series. Yeah, it's very critical of McClellan. I spent a few years working at Antietam, and visitors who come in, they tend to come in with the same lines about McClellan. Right. He's slow. He didn't. He put his troops in piecemeal. And I think recently there's been a bit of, I won't call them McClellan apologists, but certainly among, I think, the Ranger staff at Antietam, there's a much kinder interpretation to McClellan. I think maybe sometimes goes overboard, but I'm interested in, so you got this guy McClellan that you can't ignore. How do you approach him, and what did you ultimately find about McClellan?
What you need to do with someone like McClellan, because he's a controversial character, there's no getting around it. He had the misfortune of, after he died, the editor who published all of his letters to his wife, which really hurt his reputation a lot. But I think even without those, he would have been controversial. I mean, all you have to do is read his correspondence in the official records, and you'll find out, if you live with him long enough, he's incredibly frustrating. He is incredibly frustrating. I can fully understand why Lincoln and others had a lot of problems with him. But again, going back to what I was talking about, you need to be fair and you need to be objective and you need to be honest to these people that McClellan had strengths and McClellan had weaknesses. So your job as a historian is to make sure the reader understands both of them. That he's not a fool. He was a very, very bright guy. But the worst thing you can do is to say, my purpose of my book is going to be to redeem George McClellan's reputation. Well, folks, you're writing a legal brief. That's not history. That's not your job. Or to degrade this person's reputation. Your job is to research and interpret what you've researched, and you have to make some conclusions about it. But there were several things that I learned, particularly in writing that first chapter here, is that he was consistently surprised by the enemy. He consistently overestimated the enemy's numbers. And this was a man who had been a railroad executive before the war. He should have known the rail capacity. He should have known the ability of what the South could mobilize, the manpower they could mobilize. He did not seem to understand that at all. Neither did his best buddy in the Army, John Porter. The two of them were birds of a feather and always overestimating enemy strength. He surrendered the initiative to the enemy repeatedly. He doesn't do that in the Maryland campaign, though. So you have to give him credit for that. One of the things I try to give him credit for, and I dread the thought of the place, is that, and I know a lot of people don't believe this about him, but I'm telling you it's true. He believed he was outnumbered at the Battle of Antietam. Now we all go, oh, that's nonsense. I mean, look at the numbers. 40,000 Confederates, 87,000 Union. Well, they didn't know those numbers. He did believe he was outnumbered. He thought the Confederates had over 100,000 men, and he was taking a great risk in fighting an offensive battle. And when you understand that, you begin to understand why McClellan fights the Battle of Antietam the way he does. But what I try to get at the last chapter, when he gets removed from command, is to help the reader understand why Lincoln chose then to relieve him. Now, it was political because the election of the fall of 1862 was over. And even though the Republicans got pounded, they didn't get pounded as badly as Lincoln thought they might. And he was free now to remove the darling of the Democrats, which was George McClellan. But he also gave McClellan, another one of the things that I found with McClellan that was really interesting, and with Lincoln, is that one of the narratives that's evolved in recent times is that Lincoln really just wanted to get rid of McClellan. I'm like, that's interesting. Why would he put this guy in command after the disaster at Manassas? Why wouldn't he have just picked somebody else if he really was that adamant that he didn't want McClellan back in command? And then once the Battle of Antietam is over, you've invested all this in this general. You're going to get rid of him now? He just delivered the victory that enabled you to issue the Emancipation Proclamation. So what I found with Lincoln was that he went above and beyond the call of duty as a president to protect McClellan and to help McClellan. He was trying to keep McClellan if he possibly could. But he reached the point where, he'd made a decision in his mind when McClellan moved into Northern Virginia, if the Army of Northern Virginia got between McClellan and Richmond, he was going to relieve McClellan. And that's exactly what happened. McClellan didn't make any blunders. He didn't his advance wasn't, bungled. His advance was just typically very cautious and slow of George McClellan. And what I think Lincoln saw in him was that this man is never going to win the war. And we have to move on from him. He also is a bit of a dinosaur in the way that he views the war. He's viewing the war in a way that he wants a limited war. And that's never going to win this war. So Lincoln realized, I have to move on from him. And so McClellan is he's one of these people that somebody might say that I'm a little bit more down on McClellan than up on McClellan. I think I'm objective about McClellan. That's what I try to be. That's what I want to be. I want to point out what he did well, and I also want to point out what he didn't do well and the mistakes that he made, because I think that's being honest to McClellan and his memory. And, like I said before, you're not writing a legal brief, you're writing history here.
I want to switch from McClellan to Lee. And one of the things that I always struggled with is why does Lee decide to fight at Antietam? And E.P. Alexander, and I'm going to paraphrase this, but he would later say that the decision to fight at Antietam was, quote, the greatest military blunder that General Lee ever made. So I guess my question to you is what does Lee have to gain by fighting at Antietam? He's got the Potomac River to his back. What did he hope to achieve with that battle?
Lee thinks he has a lot to gain by fighting the battle. So Lee, I think we go overboard sometimes with Lee about he's this reckless gambler. Lee is a gambler. He is a risk taker, but he is a calculated risk taker. So he'll play for big odds in the poker game, but he knows that if he's playing for big odds, he wants a big reward from playing for the big odds. So when Lee goes into Maryland, he's playing for high stakes. It's just like when he came into Pennsylvania in 1863. He's playing for very high stakes. He's not coming up here to feed his army. He's coming up here for a paradigm shift in the war. And that's what Lee is trying to do, and that's why I think Lee not accepts battle. When you think about this, who forced the Battle of Antietam? Not McClellan. Lee did. Lee had time to withdraw his army over the Potomac River and not fight a battle. And as critics like E.P. Alexander, who's a really good critic, I think. So great accounts that E.P. Alexander wrote, his personal memoirs and then his published history, military memoirs of a Confederate. But Lee would, I think, and he never told us, he never wrote down, this is why I decided to fight. So we have to extrapolate it. And my extrapolation Maybe Lee says, no, it's not true, but I think it is. So Lee, why does Lee go into Maryland? Well, he goes into Maryland because what he's trying to do is win Confederate independence. How are they going to do that? They're not going to do it by conquering the North. They're never going to conquer the North. Lee knows that. That's an unrealistic objective. So then how do you win? How do you win? How did North Vietnam win in Vietnam? Did they conquer the United States of America? No, never. They probably lost every battle they fought against the United States. Their strategy, like the strategy that Lee was trying to employ, was to damage the morale of the northern people, the voter. That's the white male population living in the North. They're the voting public. But also, you're trying to damage the morale of the female population because they're going to influence the male voter in the household and how they might vote. So what you're trying to do, what Lee said he wanted to win was heavy victories. And what he meant by that was, I want to fight battles that do a lot of damage to the enemy and we don't take that much damage. And what that's going to do is erode the will of the northern people to execute this war. Keep in mind, no one had ever conquered, except maybe Genghis Khan, a territory as big as the American South. Nobody. So what Lee sees is what's on my side is we have a lot of territory. They have to concentrate. They have to conquer us. We don't have to conquer them. We simply have to wear them out. So why does he accept battle at Sharpsburg? Or why does he force battle at Sharpsburg? He's fighting McClellan. He's taken McClellan's measure. He knows McClellan's a cautious general. So if McClellan attacks him and he repulses the attacks, what might McClellan do? Well, he might just hunker down behind Antietam Creek and then, campaign's over. But he might withdraw to South Mountain. That's the most defensible position if he fell back to South Mountain, if he's really cautious. Falls back towards his supply base fortifications of Washington. Now Lee's campaign north of the Potomac River is still on. The road is open to Pennsylvania. Now, people point out like, oh my God, didn't Lee realize that his army was falling apart? He had thousands of stragglers and so on. Well, yeah, he did seem to be a little bit oblivious to the condition of his army. But the key thing I think to understand about Lee is that Lee was always an opportunist. He was always seeking to make moves that created opportunities for him and to seize opportunities. So I think what he's fighting the Battle of Sharpsburg for is he's going to try and create an opportunity for himself to keep the war north of the Potomac River. Because when the war's north of the Potomac River, the pressure is on the Lincoln administration, the pressure is on the northern people. His army still seems to be invincible and unbeatable. That's the message that Lee is trying to send continually in this war up through the Gettysburg campaign. So I think the Battle of Antietam, Sharpsburg is consistent with Lee's strategic thinking up through there.
Mm-hmm. So I have a lot more questions, but I also want to be respectful of the audience, who I'm sure have their questions of their own. So I'll ask you one more before we turn it over to the audience, and maybe we'll get to the other ones. What do you want people to walk away with after reading your book, or books rather? Why should Americans care about the Battle of Antietam?
Well, those are two things. One, why should you care about the Battle of Antietam? Well, for one reason, when I hear all these fools in America today talking about another civil war, read that book, because you don't want one. None of those men who went through that battle, that's why the title of the book, they did not want that again. That was enough. So if there's one thing that I hope you learn is that, this was not a football game. This was a really horrific event. It was a utter failure of our political system to deal with an incredibly tricky political problem and social and economic problem, slavery. The thing I'd say that I want people to take away from the book is this is ultimately a human story, I'm trying to tell a story of people. I don't care if you remember that the 6th Wisconsin was in front of the 2nd Wisconsin and the 19th Indiana was behind them and the 7th Wisconsin were. I don't care if you remember that. This is a story about people and going through an extraordinary event, and they have their successes and they have their failures. Because there's a lot of stories I tell throughout the book deliberately of people who fail, people who just simply cannot face this horrific thing called battle. And then those who do and do their duty. But I also want people to remember that there's a price paid for those who do their duty and keep at it and go into Fredericksburg and go into Gettysburg. And if they survive those battles, it's takes a toll on people, things like this. So it's also, I always tell people, I'm like, the battle chapters are really interesting, but make sure you read the whole book, because the whole book tells a whole story. And a battle is more than everybody shooting each other. That's part of a battle. But if you're a soldier who's wounded, another part of the battle is how you get treatment, how you recover from your wounds. Another part of the battle is, how somebody living at the roulette farm copes with the aftermath of the battle and the literal destruction of their entire farm. Or somebody who's at home and their husband's been killed, and the only thing they have from them is a lock of hair that one of the guys in his unit sent to them. And so these are all part of the battle. So that I try to tell the whole story. That's one of the things I wanted to do with this book, is not just it's not just a battle book. It's the story of a battle. And in some ways, like one of the things we tried to do in the museum here is, we thought it was really important when we were deciding on the galleries that we have a gallery on the campaign of Gettysburg, because typically we don't pay any attention to the campaign. We want to get right into the battle. But for soldiers who participated in it, the campaign was a really, really big thing, because that was all the maneuver and the hardships and everything that they went through. And so we added that campaign gallery to make sure that people understood that full story. So that's what I tried to do with the book here.
Folks, join me in thanking Scott Hartwig. All right, questions from you all? I see Al over there in the corner.
Hey, Scott.
Hey, Al.
Thanks for the great program.
Thanks.
There's a bit of a controversy over McClellan's reaction to the lost orders, Special Orders 191. There are some, such as Stephen Sears, who said that he delayed too long. There are other defenders of him who said that, no, Sears has the timing off by 12 hours. Where do you stand on this?
Yeah, I think Sears actually, the last thing I saw that Sears wrote about this, he had changed his timing to the new timing, and that the message that he sends to Lincoln that is 12 M, that Sears thought was 12 meridian, which everybody thought was 12 meridian, because in the Army of the Potomac, that's what they always used when it was 12 noon. They put 12 M, 12 meridian. What I found when I worked on this is I looked at all the evidence on both sides, and initially I was skeptical of the evidence that it wasn't 12 noon that he sent that. And then the more I examined the evidence, the more I became convinced that, particularly looking at some of the correspondence that's in the McClellan papers that is not in the official records, it became clear to me that he didn't write that at 12 noon. That I forget what time it was that he received the orders, but when he received the orders, he was at Burnside's headquarters. Because another thing people don't realize is that the command of the Army of the Potomac had just ridden into Frederick the day he received Special Orders number 191. That's, I'm presuming everybody knows what that is, so I shouldn't. Special Orders number 191 was the operational orders that Robert E. Lee drafted for all of his commanders in the operation to capture Harper's Ferry. And somebody, in one of the weirdest stories in the Civil War, wrapped the orders around 3 cigars and put them in a manila envelope and then dropped them somehow in the camps of General D.H. Hill. And D.H. Hill claims he never saw the orders. The staff work in the Army of Northern Virginia was atrociously bad. So the other thing about this is that nobody at Army of the Potomac headquarters ever paid note that they never received. You're supposed to get a receipt back from the commander who received the order. That way you know the order was delivered. Nobody noticed that they never got a receipt from D.H. Hill. D.H. Hill never thought anything was amiss because he received a copy of the orders from Stonewall Jackson, who wrote them out by hand and sent them to D.H. Hill. And after the war, D.H. Hill produced this copy of the orders that he had from Stonewall Jackson. And he says, I never got the other orders. We'll never know, did he? And then they just kind of like, I already got those, take them back or whatever. We don't know what happened there. All we know is it was dropped in a field in the camps of D.H. Hill's division, and then was discovered by soldiers of the 27th Indiana on the morning of September the 13th. And then they were passed up all the way up to the Corps Command. And the Corps was commanded by General Alpheus Williams at that time. And as fate would have it, it was a small world. It was Robert S. Chilton was Lee's chief of staff who had signed Special Orders 191. And Robert Chilton, before the war, had been the paymaster at the U.S. Army post in Detroit, Michigan. And one of the staff officers for Alpheus Williams had been a teller at the bank that Chilton had done all the official banking for the Army. So he knew Chilton's signature really, really well. He's like, that's Chilton's signature right there. So this order's genuine. So then eventually they take it up to McClellan. So the way I put this to visitors, I say, okay, you're McClellan, you just received Special Orders number 191. So what you're going to do right now is you're going to order your entire army to march through the night and attack the Confederates, right? Are you all going to do that? You sure that he followed that order? You sure it's not some sort of a ruse? Don't you think maybe you might want to ground truth the order? Well, that's exactly what McClellan did. So at 3 p.m., he sends a message off to his cavalry commander, Alfred Pleasanton. He asks Pleasanton, he sends him some pertinent sections of the orders, and he says, see if the Confederates followed this order of march. It's apparent to me, but there's no evidence to this, that he also had his chief sleuth, Alan Pinkerton, working his way in Frederick, trying to find out what he could from any sources in Frederick as to the order of march of the Confederates. Did they follow this order of march? So you're trying to confirm whether they used this order or they didn't use this order, because there were some things that in intelligence reports Lee was receiving, like there were Confederates at Hagerstown. That's not in Special Orders number 191. That was an adaptation that Lee made to it when he started the movement on September the 10th. He decided to move part of his army up to Hagerstown, which was not in Special Orders 191. Anyway, by late afternoon, McClellan was convinced that the orders were genuine, and at 6 p.m. he writes his first operational orders to 6th Corps Commander William B. Franklin. And then you can look at the timing of all the orders that he sends out as he goes through the evening. The orders are going out to the other corps commanders, Hooker, Sumner, Burnside, etc., as to when they're supposed to move their men. Also, one of the things McClellan gets really raked over the coals over is he doesn't order any troops to march over South Mountain on September the 13th. That is not true. He sent 3 divisions of the 9th Corps, which had 4 divisions. He sent 3 divisions over Catoctin Mountain into the Middletown Valley. So he did move some troops over the mountains in front of Frederick. But anyway, so once he's finished all his operational orders to everybody, then he has time now to write to the Army General-in-Chief, Henry Halleck. He tells Halleck, and then he writes to the president. So the timing of everything, and also we imagine that he sent this message by telegraph from Frederick. It actually had to go down to Point of Rocks, and then the people at Point of Rocks actually transmitted the message to D.C. So the timing of the message, that it was sent actually at midnight, not at noon, the evidence to me was there to support that. So that's kind of where I came down on it. Yeah. Yeah, over there.
What is your opinion of Lee's performance as a commander at Antietam, I think that there were many times that McClellan had him dead to rights during that battle, but for some reason Lee just kept being able to get the right people in at the right time to keep from turning that battle into a disaster. So I think McClellan wasted so many opportunities.
Yeah, that's a really good question. Lee, it was a masterful performance by Lee. I mean, it really was. It was a masterful performance. He, just the other night, I was talking to the Hagerstown Civil War Roundtable, and I was talking about Joe Hooker, who I think, amongst like corps commanders, was the best general on the Antietam battlefield. And one of the things that Hooker did really, really well, that Lee also did really, really well, is they, what I say, saw the battlefield. And what I mean by that is not, you can't see some things with your own eyes. You sense it, you feel it. You sense weakness, you sense danger, where to move troops. And the only way you do that is you have to really keep your finger on the pulse of the battle. And Hooker did that so well on the north end of the battlefield. But Lee did it really, really well for the Confederates. He had a good sense. He also had a lot of people who were helping him, who were sending him requests for help. But the thing that I think Lee does so well is that, at certain points in the battle, a lot of people need help. A lot of people need help. And you have to take certain risks, like a big one was taking John Walker's division, which was guarding Snavely's Ford at the far right end of the Army, and shifting that all the way to the left flank of the Army. Same thing could be said for taking Lafayette McLaws's division and shifting it to the left of the Army, because that was one of his reserves. And once, as a commanding general, you commit your reserve, you can't get it back. It's committed. So Lee, his commitment of his reserves is masterful in the battle. It really is. I mean, it's just masterful. And I think a lot of it has to do with that Lee realizes it's going to be a desperate battle. It is a desperate battle, and he keeps his finger on the pulse of the battle. James Longstreet, he said after the war, he said, every major movement of troops at Antietam, save for the attack of John Bell Hood's division, was ordered by Lee. So, I mean, yeah, I think Lee does exceptionally well in the battle.
The battle is can't ever be extricated from the Emancipation Proclamation coming later. Given everything we've studied about the battle, and then obviously the soldiers on the field have no idea the Emancipation Proclamation is coming, but Lincoln issued the preliminary proclamation shortly after. Everything you've studied about the battle, what do you see as the impact of sort of the combination of the battle that they think is more or less a victory to allow Lincoln to issue this Emancipation Proclamation? Those two things sort of went hand in hand. What do you see as the overall impact?
Can everybody hear the question? Okay, the question is about how did the soldiers, particularly the soldiers in the Union Army, and the population in general, view the Battle of Antietam, and in combination with the Emancipation Proclamation, the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. Generally, if you're looking at the time, the way they viewed it, because attitudes are going to change over the coming months, because at the moment that it's coming out, the way people thought about it is divided by what political party you belong to. So one of the big myths of the Emancipation Proclamation, and when I worked here at Gettysburg, I heard it all the time from various Rangers who were like, the Army was completely opposed to the Emancipation Proclamation. They didn't believe in it. And I'm like, I don't believe that's true. If you're a Republican, you supported it. If you're a Democrat, you probably didn't support it. The conservatives didn't like it. The progressives, the Republicans did like it. But there were people on both sides that, there were a lot of Democrats who were like, I don't like it, but as long as the rebels are in arms, I'm fighting. And, so that's kind of how they fell out at the time. I think the Emancipation Proclamation and the Battle of Antietam are one of those things that it's going to take months or years for people to really start to completely understand their importance. And so what I try and say in the book here is that the Battle of Antietam is a drawn battle. By the end of the battle, the Confederate Army is still essentially in the position that they were in at the beginning of the battle, and the Union Army is essentially in the position they were in. The Confederates have been hurt really bad. So the Confederate Army lost 27% of their effective strength. The Union Army lost 22%. That's not the percentage you want if you're the defending army. The defending army should always lose less percentage than the attacking army. So that tells you the Union Army fought really, really well at Antietam. But anyway, so the battle is tactically a drawn battle. Operationally, so we're talking about the theater, the Maryland, Northern Virginia theater, it's a Union victory. McClellan achieves his objective, and that is to remove the Confederate Army from north of the Potomac River to back into Virginia. He achieves that objective. That's an operational victory. What makes Antietam a strategic victory is the Emancipation Proclamation. But you're not going to understand that for months to come. And it's a strategic victory because, one, in one fell swoop, Lincoln pretty much guarantees that Europe is never going to recognize the Confederacy. They're not going to intervene in the war. That's strategic. When you take them out, they're off the table. They're not going to support, a slaveholding republic. And then the second part of it also has to do with slavery. Slaves in the areas the Emancipation Proclamation applies to are going to try and get away to the Union Army as soon as they hear the Union Army is getting close. So the enslaved labor force of the South is their labor force. So they got to protect it. So you're going to have to keep some of your manpower back in order to protect your enslaved labor source. That's strategic as well for Lincoln. So it was, to me, yes, you can look at the Emancipation Proclamation and you can say it was the right thing to do, morally right thing to do. But it was also, to me, a brilliant strategic move on Lincoln's part. So that makes Antietam a strategic victory. And some of the soldiers who fought the battle never understood that. George McClellan never understood it. He never understood that. He just temperamentally, as his political views went, he couldn't understand it. But there were others who did. There were others who were opposed to the Emancipation Proclamation who, 9 months later, were okay with it because they're like, we just want to win this war and we'll use whatever means we have to. So I think it's also important with things like that you don't just take one soldier or one account or it's black and white. It's not always black and white. A lot of times there's gray area in there. You had a question right there.
I did. When you look in the bookstore, you see thousands of titles, and when you refer back to the original topic, the craft of writing your histories, how did you come up with that title? And how many titles did you have in your head before you settled on that one?
I didn't have any other titles. Once I started to think of a title, I had read Rufus Dawes' service with the 6th Wisconsin Volunteers years before. It was always one of my top 10 favorite Civil War memoirs because Dawes was a very honest individual. And he also included in his book letters that he wrote to his girlfriend, Mary Gates, who he married. And I remember when I read the letter that he wrote June 18th, 1863 during the Gettysburg campaign, and when I read this letter, I was like, that's the title to the book, because that captures the way so many people thought about this battle. And what it was is they had just completed this long march. Everybody was really tired. They were going into bivouac. And Dawes saw one of these newspaper guys running around, because they did that every day. They were delivering papers, and he got a paper from them, and he picks the paper up, and he's looking at the paper, and the paper says, "Another battle at Antietam on Tapas." And, that really bothered Dawes. And then he writes, "I hope not. The flower of our regiment was slaughtered in that terrible cornfield. I never want to fight there again. I dread the thought of the place." And when I read that, I was like, that's your title right there. because that captures it. And it's something that's written by someone who lived it. So that's how I came up with the title.
You have time for one more, Scott.
Okay. Yeah. Over here.
Could you comment on the day after the battle, Lee's refusal to withdraw and McClellan's refusal to resume the attack?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I'll try and encapsulate it as quickly as I can because it's actually kind of a big question. So the narrative is McClellan's a timid coward. Lee is the resourceful, audacious commander who, shows his superiority over McClellan, and that's why he stays on September 18th. And the reality was, if you were George McClellan, remember what I said, he believes he's outnumbered in the battle. Now, his army fought really well. He knows his army fought well. But one of the keys to his success has been the firepower of the 20-pound Parrott rifles, which is on the east bank of Antietam Creek. They are out of ammunition. So they are trying to express rush through a load of ammunition to the Army for the 20-pound Parrott rifles, as they fired the entire day. So they fired all their ammo in the limber chests and the caissons, and then they fired through all their ammo that was in the artillery trains. So that's one thing that's a big deal for McClellan. He wants to have that extra firepower in there. He also, since he thinks he's outnumbered, he wants the maximum number of troops that he can have, and he has one infantry division that has not yet reached the field, and that is Andrew Humphrey's division, which is all brand new regiments, but it's 6,000 men. So they're hurrying Humphreys to the field. And so but there is a part of McClellan who I think is hesitant to renew the battle until he's got a sure thing. So he doesn't really want to renew the battle on the 18th. He's hoping that Lee's going to do something, which Lee does, which is he withdraws during the night of the 18th. So why does Lee stay there at Antietam? Is it because he's audacious? I think it's because he's pragmatic. So if you put yourself, so what I tried to do is put myself in Lee's shoes. So the battle is over. You've taken 10,000 casualties. You have thousands of wounded at hospitals behind your lines. You have some wounded that still haven't been transported to the hospitals. You have limited transportation to move your wounded. You have thousands and thousands of stragglers behind your army that are just wandering around, separated from their units, and not in a hurry to get back to their units. So you got to get those stragglers back because you don't want to lose them. And then how are you going to get all your wounded? Because you're going to have to retreat because your army's beat up. And even though you've driven a lot of stragglers up from the marches up from Harper's Ferry, a lot of those stragglers have been rejoined with their units. Lee probably received up to 4,000 reinforcements during the night of September 17th of stragglers who were driven up to their units in the army, which makes up some of his losses. But he gives orders to his subordinate commanders to resist if attacked, but not to precipitate any fighting. So don't fire upon them unless they fire upon you. So he does not want to fight on September 18th at all. What he's trying to do is you have to organize your transportation that you have, figure out what wounded are at what hospitals, and the surgeons have to determine what wounded are capable of transportation or of ambulatory movement. You have to get them moving, those are ambulatory, to Bottler's Ford. You have to find the transportation and move it to the hospitals that exist. The surgeons also have to determine those medical supplies and surgeons who are going to stay behind with the two seriously wounded to be moved. You got to do it all in one day. You have one day to do it. And you also have to collect as many of your stragglers as you can. So the reason I think that Lee, that's what I argue in here, that Lee stays on September 18th is completely pragmatic. He stays there so that he can start getting his wounded moved out and lose as few of them as possible and to gather his stragglers up. And then once he knows that he only has a limited amount of time because McClellan inevitably is going to attack him again and he wants to get out before he gets attacked. So I think that's what happens on September 18th. It's why McClellan doesn't attack Lee and why Lee doesn't try to precipitate any fighting, and then also Lee withdraws during the night of the 18th.
Yeah. Folks, I will remind you, Scott will be signing books in the bookstore right after this. But one last time, let's thank Scott Harwig.
Cool.
Thank you, Sharon. It's good to hear your voice.
Yes.
Hey, Matt, I just want one more thing, and this is for you, and then I'll go. And this is what you should do, because you're supposed to take advice from people who have your best interests at heart.
Correct, and you do.
Every single podcast, because every other single podcaster, and I listen to a lot of them, history and otherwise, does this. And I encourage you to say it every single podcast, because it works. If you like this podcast and what we're doing here, please like, share, and subscribe. Hit that notification bell so you don't miss any of the upcoming interesting history podcasts here at Addressing Gettysburg. It really helps the channel, and it's completely free. That's the best thing. It's completely free. Please help us make our goal of 25,000 subscribers by Memorial Day. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you.
Beautiful.
Thank you.
I'm putting that in a promo.